First, Kirk, before we talk about the pre-draft process, I guess it's been almost a month since the season ended there in Sacramento. I guess just with the month that has passed, how have you just reflected on the season and where do you think things kind of went wrong and what do you think you guys could really take from last year?
Yeah, I mean, you have to move on pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's over and done. At some point, it ends for 29 teams. One team wins. Just
Yeah.
a question of when. Unfortunately, earlier than we're used to, and earlier than we wanted to and planned to. But it means that you have a little bit more time to prep for the next season. What is hard is when you go deep into these seasons, and obviously we've been privileged and fortunate to have that happen a lot. It's really hard to do the off season. It's
Yeah.
so compressed. So if you're looking for a bright side, of which, to be honest, for the most part, there aren't many, losing early, it's that you have a lot more time to prep for the next season. And there are just so many things going on between pre-draft and then ultimately free agency and summer league. And then before you know it, you're rolling into the next season. So there's quite a lot that has to get done. There's, a lot of people's, your staff, you have to get figured out. Some people's contracts are up or you got to figure out what's got to change. So if there is a bright side, that's it. We got a little bit more time to kind of get our ducks in the row, take these processes a little bit, more in order.
Right.
Pre-draft process especially. Typically we are doing these during the playoffs, and there's just a lot of movement
Yes.
around. It's why you got to do your work early with respect to pre-draft stuff, and we'll obviously get into that.
Right. Now, I guess, what is the Warriors' philosophy going into a pre-draft process? Is it something that changes every year based on personnel and what you guys need? Or is it more something that you guys kind of have etched in stone, like this is how we look at it going into it every year?
I would say for the most part, we have certain things that are the same every year. And there's certain, I guess you'd call them like organizational tentpoles that will always remain. Ways of doing things, the way we look at things in general. That said, I think you try to evolve every year. So we are always doing a postmortem after every draft. We do a postmortem kind of right after when it's fresh, but you also do one a few months later. And then we like to do them every year, every couple years. So we look back at the last couple of years and think what did we learn from that? What would we have done differently? What is new that we didn't know, or maybe everyone didn't know at the time? What sort of new technologies or other things that give you a little advantage? What's available that wasn't available then? But I think those postmortems are pretty valuable. I would say for the most part things stay the same.
Right.
But along the edges, we certainly try to get better every year, and you have to.
Right.
But there shouldn't be a ton of surprises during this process. Hopefully you have done the majority of your work already, and there's stuff along the edges that will inform you to kind of ultimately mold what your board looks like.
Right. And this year, obviously, every year going into a draft is unique because you have different assets every single year. This year, obviously, you have a first-round pick, but it could convey to Portland, and obviously you have a second-round pick. I guess you guys still probably have to do the same homework just because you don't really know what could happen. An offer could come up to you guys. There's somebody you like might drop, so you hop up. So, is it kind of you have to have that mentality no matter where you're picking?
Yeah, you always do the work, no matter what, because you just never know in this league. I mean, we have had a player get injured the morning of the draft, and suddenly be out for the year. And you're wondering, should this change our approach to the draft or not, right? That's a very human thing to question. But I think that you have to have certain standards, and you have to set those, and you have to stick to them no matter what, because the draft info you're doing, it's not all this intel and all this work. It matters a lot for this draft, but it's also for the next 3 or 4 years, because a lot of these players, you're looking at a longer term arc. And so you actually want to know, is this a player that we really would want to trade for in the future? What does their development curve look like?
Right.
Is this a player that we're interested in, but we kind of like them to go somewhere else first, and then we can try to get them in the next bid? Or what are we going to need to know when we're doing pro scouting later? What's that one little bit of information that we could have gotten during the draft process that will be helpful figuring out who they are and if they could fit us later on?
Yeah, that's funny you say that, because doing sidelines with Santa Cruz this year, Nick multiple different times just talking about certain players is like, oh, this is a guy who we've known about for like 4 years and we've been interested in. Now there he is in Santa Cruz.
Eventually your draft profile and your pro scouting profile merge.
Right.
And this is true with players playing international too. A lot of those guys we follow, we knew them during the draft process. They maybe weren't ready for the NBA, but you track them and you see, is this something that's allowed them to learn how to be a better fit? Have they grown? Once you start a profile on a player, it sticks with them for their whole career.
Right.
Look, we got guys who work with us like Zaza now, who I can go back and give him his pro. I mean, obviously he was drafted much before kind of our current system, but like I got pro scouting reports on Zaza that I like to show him from back in the day.
Right.
So we got our whole profile on him. Helps in pickup games.
Yeah. Now this is like a debate that you'll hear in every sport, going back for ages now, and I'm just curious where you fall on it. Are you more of a best player available type guy, or do you draft more for need?
I don't think it's as black and white as that. I think that to some extent there's the easiest way to describe it would be tiers. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, if there's a player who's so incredibly talented, like that puts him at the top. You should draft him no matter what your situation is.
Figure it out later.
Yeah, I mean, those are generational players, right? We all know who they are. They're handful of guys over the last 5 years that if you had the chance to draft him, it doesn't matter what your team looks like. Like this guy is going to be an absolute all NBA guy. And after that, it becomes a little bit more situation dependent, I think. And that's where it's not as black and white. There's certainly a level of talent that you're always going to take over anything else. But after that, this is where tiers come to place. How well does a guy fit your team stylistically? How well does a player fit a timeline, both for themselves and for you? How soon do you need a player, but also how soon will that player be ultimately ready given their opportunities with you? And that stuff can shift quickly too.
Right.
Like you may have a situation that's true today and tomorrow your team situation is different. So you can't be too locked into one or the other, but it is a reality that the situation affects the players. I mean, we have talked about how there are probably at a given time anywhere from 5 to 10 guys in the NBA who would be unbelievably successful no matter where they ended up.
Right.
Those are the dudes who, like, you could stick them with any team and they're going to be all NBA guys. There's probably another 20 to 30 after that who are all-star level guys. And, you can probably look back at guys who are 1 to 5-time all-stars, and a lot of them are somewhat dependent. There are all-star level players, but where they ended up, their teammates, their coaching staff, where they are in their careers, like all that matters. And then after that, like there are so many good basketball players in this world. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it for them depends on, did I end up in the right place at the right time with the right people?
Right.
And that's part of the puzzle that we got to figure out with a lot of these players. So it's easy to go back and be like, man, how do we miss this guy? When the reality is, like, it might not have ended up the same if that player had ended up with you.
Right.
Same thing where, man, that guy really would have fit us well. Or we screwed up how this guy's, this wasn't the right time for us to bring this guy. He would have been better off going somewhere else. So it's all about trying to figure out that puzzle. So when you ask, is it about talent or fit? The answer is both. Talent is incredibly important, but fit, and I don't just mean like style of play, but how do they fit with teammates? How do they fit in the locker room? How do they fit with specific styles of coaching? All that stuff really matters, right. I think, for a player to ultimately be successful.
Nice. Now, when you get these guys on the court for some of these pre-draft workouts, I'd assume most teams run their workouts different. Like, no, it's not all one size fits all. Yeah. When these guys get on the court here at the Chase Center, what's important for you guys to see? What is how does these workouts play out? What do you need to see from them knowing what you guys do during the season?
It's interesting because we never get to see the other workouts from the other teams. Obviously, that's proprietary to everybody, but you hear from the players,
right?
Specifically. And, of course, they're a little jaded too, right? It's their first time going through this. So sometimes you get players who've done a bunch of workouts since the last workout, and they have a certain thought. Sometimes you have a guy in their first or second workout. Sometimes you have players who did this last year. So I think every team's kind of looking for something different. For us, I mentioned this before, a lot of our work is done before we get to this mm-hmm. point. So it's really a couple things once we get them in the building. It's let's actually meet the kid.
Right.
Let's learn a little bit more about them. We like to do film sessions with them. I'd say we've really started to lean into that the last couple of years more as we've been able to do it. But you need more time to be able to do that. Film session is really about how do they read the game? What are the types of things that they notice and focus on? How have they been taught? What are the things that they are really ingrained in their brain to look at from a basketball perspective? So where are the opportunities to grow? You also just get to know the kid, like how mature are they? Where are they at in their growth as a person? And then you get to see some work ethic stuff. That's really a lot of what we're trying to get out of this is how hard does somebody work? How bad do they want it? So a lot of our drills are more focused on competing and getting through. And of course, you got to be a player early on in their first couple workouts is going to have a lot more energy. So it's really interesting. You have to be careful about this, but it's comparing the guys early on the workout to the guys later who are on their, 12th workout in 16 days. But you learn a lot about a player. How much do they have left to give, or how much, even if they're out of juice, like how much are they going to give you anyways? You definitely see certain types of players. Sometimes you'll bring in a player you might not be as interested in, but you want to see them specifically match up for a certain reason with another player you're looking at, because maybe they're not skilled, but they're just tough as and you want to see them against somebody who you think might not be that tough and see how they respond. Sometimes you want to see, a player you don't think is necessarily good enough but can really shoot the ball because you want to see how a player guards in space.
Right.
So it's that sort of thing. And then I think it's pretty human nature to want to see someone in person. You don't want to overrate, because at the end of the day, we can all watch the games and you can see that's what matters, right? It's kind of like NFL Combine, where it's like we can see how fast a guy runs in tights in a straight line, but like how often is that really relevant to football? I've talked to NFL scouts and know there's certain things where that actually does impact things at the NFL level, but for the most part, it's like, don't you want to watch the film and see the play speed of the guy? Same thing, you want to see the play speed of a player, but there are certain things like how do they deal with a coach? When a coach is giving an instruction, how quickly do they pick things up? And it's not always about ultimately where it's about what do they know right now?
Yeah.
Where are they at in terms of understanding? And then one of the most interesting things to me is it's really easy to go on a job interview and do the interview, right? Play the game, say the right things. You've studied, the right things to do on the court. But how do they treat people behind the scenes? I think some players recognize this and some are completely oblivious. I think that's pretty normal in society too. Yeah. But I always like to ask the people who aren't necessarily our talent evaluators, like, what were they like? Mm-hmm. How'd they treat you? How was the drive from the airport? What did you guys talk about? What was important to them? Right. Because that's when they don't really realize they're being interviewed.
They're not turned on.
They're not turned on. And I think you get, I can't tell you how many times you get all these players you think they're one way, and then when you finally get them in your building, like, they're not maybe completely different, but there's a few things you didn't quite realize. Right. They just have been coached up.
Yeah. Do you guys ever, are there ever current players on the roster who are around when some of these guys working out that kind of involve themselves in either the on-floor workout or kind of interact with the guys when they're here during their quote-unquote interview, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, they can't be on the court with them.
Okay.
That's against the rules. You get these great stories back in the day of, I think it was Michael Cooper or something trying to guard Kobe in his workout. And that'd be pretty cool. You can't do that anymore. So we do have players who tend to be around. It depends on the timing of these workouts and where you're in the season. I think historically Draymond's been pretty involved. He loves to be around this sort of stuff, and he loves the draft. So he'll come and watch workouts. That's typically as we get closer to the draft. And I think what's great about that is he'll see certain things as an active player and someone who'd be in the locker room with somebody that we might not focus on as much. And sometimes that's important and sometimes it's less important, but it's interesting nonetheless. And he'll also go talk to players afterwards and get a sense for what they're like. We've had other guys. Moses tends to be around a good amount. JK comes to a good amount of these workouts. I think sometimes you get these younger guys like right now, Brandon and Trace and Guy and all. They're all working out here.
Yeah.
So they will very likely they're going to finish their workout or they'll be right after. So they'll be around and they'll watch this stuff. And for a lot of them, it's fresh.
Yeah.
Right. They just went through this last year or 2 years ago. So they've got some thoughts on it. They also usually know some of these guys or played with them. And so, I've sat down with guys before and said, hey, I saw that you played with this guy or you were in the same class as him. Do you ever play against him in AAU? And you'll get some pretty good stories. You'll be like, actually, I was roommates with him at this camp.
Right.
Here's what I can tell you about him.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, you fall into that intel, and it can be helpful for sure. But in terms of overall player involvement, it's not like we plan something.
Right.
We can't control.
Yeah.
Other than
Who's in town? Who's
yeah,
gonna be
it's
around.
hard. Other than certain workout schedules when we know a guy's in town, it's pretty hard to control that.
Cool. Well, you walked me into my last question, really. Brandon and Trace, obviously, 2 great rookie seasons last year, all rookie caliber years. So it's safe to say you guys hit on both of those prospects. So just going back to their pre-draft prospects, pre-draft workouts and stuff, like what do you remember about them during this period when they came into the building? How long had you been looking at those guys?
So I think first I would remind these guys is one season does not make a career.
Right.
We have had players come in here and have an awesome rookie season and and help us win championships, and then not quite had the same impact going forward. So we remind those guys every day, like, you were good as a rookie. It's about getting better.
Right.
This is a great place to start, but it doesn't really mean anything. Like, all rookie team doesn't really mean anything at the end of the day. So I'm glad those two get that. Mm-hmm. They seem to, they agree that they haven't accomplished much yet. It's great that they have a good foundation. But, I think you always, look, when you draft a guy, you tend to go back and remember more things than the guys you didn't draft. There are things you remember specifically about players that you didn't draft. I think what stood out, those two guys were a little different. Brandon really didn't come onto the radar until the start of his sophomore college season. Mm-hmm. You may have seen his name on a scouting, but he didn't really play at Illinois as a freshman, and he wasn't really a highly ranked recruit. He was a decent recruit, but not on NBA radars. So with that, it's different because you're trying to work a lot more into a smaller time frame, mm-hmm. A shorter time frame. And, there were some questions we had to answer about him. I think what we had heard intel-wise, we wanted to see backed up, this guy is super competitive, tries to win every possession. He will scrap and find a way to win. And we saw a lot of that. He was really competitive, and I think it was really interesting going to a film session with him. The things he remembered and how he viewed the game was really fascinating. I remember specifically having a conversation with him about his defense. That was a question, I think, for a lot of scouts, and we not only asked him but challenged him on certain aspects. And I think he answered the call pretty well for a rookie. I think he had a good year, and it's interesting. We actually had to go back and look at was he a good charge drawer in college? We don't remember that being the key part of the scouting report, but we remembered him being kind of a playmaker,
right,
on defense. So and then Trace different. We had been watching him for 4 years. We had him graded as a first-round pick as a freshman in college. So then you're watching every year he goes back. Okay, we like this guy. We think he's got great potential. Now we get to see how much of it he, gets to each year.
Right.
And I think what was great about Trace is that he improved all 4 years, and then we finally got him in the building, and it was about seeing, what sort of drive does he have, what sort of toughness. And what I remember really sticking out is we thought this was true on film, but we really tested it in a couple drills. We thought he had really good hands, and we really wanted to focus on it. We purposely had coaches throwing the balls all over the place with him, throwing tough passes,
right,
off timing stuff, and it was really noticeable. He was, it was like watching a really great wide receiver who's out there practicing one-handed, stick 'em catches.
Right.
He was really good on the move. Not just catching, but being able to catch and immediately process what to do next. We also tried to speed him up. That was something we had noticed in college. He had really, really great ability to stay calm.
Right.
Well, that's great when you're a lot bigger and better than everybody else. Was that going to translate? So we really tried to get him sped up, and he did a really good job. And again, we wanted to see how tough and competitive he was, and he passed that with flying colors. So, like I said, look, you get all this information, and it gets you 95% of the way there, and then there's some luck involved for sure. And things change too. People grow up and change once they get to you, once they sign an NBA contract, that sort of thing. But, those two, it was memorable. I will tell you the most memorable draft workout we have had in the time I've been here, about 14 years, is Draymond Green. We'll still never forget that one.
Well, tell me a little bit about that.
We already loved Draymond. He was kind of, I like to say, from the island of misfit toys. It's like everyone knew he was really good, but we weren't really sure what it is how he's going to fit.
Right.
But we knew he was a hell of a basketball player. And we came in here and he just absolutely destroyed everyone. And what showed through was his competitiveness was so high. It's hard to describe without you getting to see it, but like there's a difference between watching somebody be competitive and somebody being maniacally competitive and trying to destroy everybody in every single drill for an hour straight.
Right.
I've never really seen anything like it. It was really fun to watch. I mean, it got to the point where the other 5 guys kind of wanted to quit. And at the time you're like, well, maybe these guys aren't that competitive.
Right.
But you're like, man, this guy is just a killer.
Yeah.
So kind of never forget that one. And obviously, look, it could have turned out different.
I was going to say, did you, after that draft, did you guys leave saying there's no way we can't get this guy? Or you're like, heck, we don't know if we're going to be able to get him?
I think Bob talked about this actually recently. We all really wanted him. He kind of fit the perfect storm of, unbelievable, unique workout here, incredibly unique interview, really unique, interesting intel, and then like his film was great, his analytical profile was great. Kind of like everything was screaming, this is a guy, and yet we still took him 35th. Part of that was draft intel at the time. We had 30 and 35, and we basically found out that Draymond was very, very likely to make it to 35. Festus was very unlikely to make it to 35, and so we made a bet and a gamble. And, no offense to Festus, great dude, love him, talk to him all the time. Like, if you look at their careers, like, you probably wouldn't make that gamble.
Right.
Seeing if Draymond's still going to be at 35. In fact, you'd probably package like 30 and 35 to make sure you get him. But at the time, obviously, we just really, really liked him and wanted him. And we were able to thread that needle and get both of them. And look, Festus was awesome for us, especially as a rookie. Had a great year. And, we're able to win a championship with both guys on the team. Yeah, I mean, it's hindsight's 20/20 on all these guys, right? Like, there are guys who you're like, man, it was so obvious this guy was going to be good. We all thought he was going to be good, but, like, it was so obvious he was going to be really good. But there are ones that, like, you end up searching, what was the thing that we missed? Like, everything pointed to this guy being good. And then it's like, we missed this one thing that, like, should have been kind of obvious.
An evolving learning process almost.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important is you got to be careful not to make things too binary.
Right.
It's not perfect science. There is a lot of science, I think, involved. There's a lot of predictive value in a lot of this stuff. But at the end of the day, like, injuries happen.
Yeah.
Circumstances change. People change. And so you are working with probabilities. And I think that's really hard for people to grasp. It's just not how our minds work. We're used to binary outcomes, good, bad.
Right.
And it's just not that simple. But it's really, really hard to remember that as you're going through the process, that, like, what my brain is really telling me is, like, there's an 85% chance this guy's going to be really good.
Right.
And the question is, how much is that 15% playing in your mind? What are the things that he could get them to fail, could cause failure? How important is it really? So that's the hard thing, I think, throughout this process, and then living with it.
Yeah.
You only get to do this once a year. You may only have 1 or 2 picks, maybe 3 in a draft. And so the odds don't always make sense, right? Like, they don't always play out. Like, maybe you hit on, like, we seem to have a great draft last year. It certainly doesn't feel good as if only one of those 2 guys works out, right? Or if you have one player in a draft and it doesn't work out, 0%. Right. So I think it's trying to keep level-headed on all this, look at the big picture, and just try to do the best job we can. And I think people also get super excited about the draft. That's another thing we got to be careful about. Is this player actually as good as we think as a prospect, and can they help us in the way we think, or is this just the best option in front of us?
Right.
I think that's because it's such an exciting, fun thing.
Yeah.
And it gets played out in the media too, right? And that reinforces us, like, oh my God, we got this guy, and he could be really good.
Yeah.
So yeah, all of that. I think it's just good to keep perspective throughout the process.
Cool. Well, Kirk, appreciate you, man.
Yeah.
Thanks for hopping on Sports Night Live.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you.